Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to you if you are in the UK. Good morning if you're in the US across the pond. My name is Gabriel Soto, and I'm a senior director at Edison Research. If you are joining me live today, thank you. Please chat amongst yourselves in the chat window. Tell us where you're from, what you do, what you think about the report. Your feedback helps us understand where to take this research in the future. Now, but if you have any questions as I go, please be sure to enter those into the Q&A window where the Edison research team is at the ready to respond to any questions. If you're watching a replay of this webinar, we're happy to answer any questions on via info@edisonresearch.com as well. Now, we can get started on the topic. So as a podcaster, it can be hard to really advocate for yourself and prove to people how valuable the medium truly is. Today, what I plan to do is what Edison Research has been doing in the US for the last 18 years, and that's arm UK-based creators with the necessary ammo that you need to lock in those resources. We'll do that by exploring the status of podcasting in the UK. And here's the pitch. No, it's not the pitch on which the English national team will be playing tonight at the Euros, but it's the pitch you need to make to secure that support that you need as a podcast creator. Here's what you should be telling advertisers, stakeholders, and others in the industry about podcasts in the UK. Now, what we know is that there are more podcast listeners than ever. They are spending a lot of time with the medium, and podcasts do an effective job at reaching all generations. Listeners are diverse ethnically and gender-wise, and they are also a highly coveted audience that for different advertisers. So first up, more Britons than ever are listening to podcasts. Over 2/3 of the United Kingdom have ever listened to one. 42% are monthly podcast listeners, and about a third are weekly listeners. It should be coming up here. Sorry for the delay in that. Each one of these figures here are a record high. So from the 69% of the UK population that listen to a podcast to the 30% of the UK population that listened to the podcast in the last week. So that's right. Podcast listening has increased on every measure compared to prior years. If we look at data in 2021, when we started collecting podcast information in the UK, that year, 59% of the population had ever listened to one at one point in their life, a rate that increased by 10 points 3 years later. Today, 38 million people have tried listening to a podcast. Monthly listening has increased as well. We field these surveys that capture these data in the spring, and you'll notice a drop from the year 2021 to 23. Like most digital media, such as Netflix, podcast consumption spiked during the early stages of the pandemic when we were all really forced to, flatten the curve and stay home. Just like Netflix, though, podcast listening was destined to pull back as people left their homes. That's likely what happened between 2021 and 23. Followed by a nice recovery to 42% of Britons who report listening to a podcast in the last month. And there's more good news. Weekly podcast listening numbers are up to 34% from 25% in 2023. That's an estimated 17 million weekly podcast listening adults in the United Kingdom. Now, at Edison Research, we pay extra attention to those weekly listeners. Edison Podcast Metric UK is really the only podcast measurement service in the region that measures the relative weekly audience size of podcasts available in the region. No opt-in is required. You can't run away from us. Every show has an opportunity to be measured, and we bypass that tricky download metric because we speak directly to consumers. They tell us what they listen to, and here is what they said. From the Joe Rogan Experience to Insanity Studio staying relevant at the end of the list, here are the top 25 podcasts in the UK based on weekly audience size in Q1 2024. Now, with the exception of the American comedian and UFC commentator at number one, all other shows are UK based. The Diary of a CEO at number two, Shagged, Married, and Annoyed at number three, all British shows. For Peter Crouch, it's Tall or Nothing. He's the former English footballer who holds the sixth and seventh positions with the Peter Crouch Show, the Peter Crouch podcast, and Therapy Couch, a show he publishes with his wife. You also see representation for the BBC there at the 15th, the 16th, and sorry, the 18th, the 20th, and the 21st positions, even in the 24th position with the show You're Dead to Me. Now, there are there are more podcast listeners than ever, as we established earlier. And shows like these, shows like yours, are reaching an engaged audience. I say that because British podcast listeners spend a lot of time with the medium. Weekly consumers spend an average of 5 hours and 27 minutes listening to podcasts in a typical week. Another angle from which to look at listening time is across four categories. The percentage of UK weekly podcast consumers who spent less than 3 hours with the medium, 3 to less than 5, 5 to less than 10, or 10 hours or more in that last category in yellow. As an example, look at the 15 to 34-year-olds. 42% spend 5 hours or more listening to their favorite shows. Consumers are engaged with their favorite podcasts just based on how much time they spend with them. There are super listeners across different age groups, and advertisers have a vast and growing opportunity to reach these listeners across every generation. Here's monthly podcast listening by age. As you can see, we are reporting growth across all age groups, 6 to 9 point increases across the board. And if we break it down one by one, we'll start with the younger group. We like to call young UK listeners loyal because they're more likely to consume podcasts than the rest of the population. The majority of 18 to 34-year-olds are monthly listeners, and 41% are weekly listeners. This age bracket is essential to the future of many businesses, hence why advertisers spend millions to connect with them. And podcasts like these, podcasts like yours, can serve as that bridge. Now, another sought after group is the 35 to 50-year-old segment. They have a significant market size, and many of them are in what many marketing experts call the prime spending years. They're making significant family purchases, home cars, purchases for their children, children's education, if they don't have kids but live with a partner, in households with dual incomes. They're what we call dinks. Yes, I myself am a dink, dual income, no kids. Whatever type of consumer you're looking to reach in the UK in this segment, podcasts are an excellent way to reach them. About half of this age group, the 35 to 54-year-olds, are monthly podcast listeners, and 34% of people in the UK in this age group are weekly podcast listeners. And also, don't underestimate the wiser segment of the UK. The 55 plus population are increasingly listening to podcasts, with 28% of those 55 plus listening monthly and 18% listening weekly. Podcasts, once again, appeal to all generations, and it's something you should be telling your stakeholders. we're seeing broad appeal across other demographics as well. The face of the podcast listener in the UK is poised to change as the medium evolves. Um, when it comes to ethnic diversity, about half of UK consumers who identify as Black say they listen to podcasts each month, a rate significantly higher than the 42% among the overall population that we saw earlier. 39% of Asian Britons listen to podcasts each month, and that's at a similar rate of the overall UK population. But I do believe these rates are poised to take off as younger generations continue to adopt podcast listening. Each freshman class of podcast listeners, those who picked up the habit in the last year, have a chance to leave their mark on the medium. And two of the things this year's newcomers are known for, are among many others, are their youth and ethnic diversity. 38% identify as Gen Z versus 14% of those who started listening more than a year ago. If we zoom in on those Gen Z newcomers, the 38% in the top bar, and compare them to the overall UK weekly podcast audience, we do get a glimpse into how the listening pool will look should young listeners continue to adopt podcasting. Gen Z newcomers are more likely or more than twice as likely to identify as Asian, nearly twice as likely to identify as Black, and twice as likely to identify as mixed. A total of 36% identify as a non-white among that Gen Z newcomer segment. As a person of color in the industry myself, I can't express how important inclusion is in the podcasting industry, not only for the sake of inclusion, but also because it's a smart business decisions for your brand and for creators in the future. Now, as a person who works at a company where many women are part of leadership, many women are part of my colleagues, and many who I have the honor of calling my mentors, had chances to discuss the importance and value of female representation in the podcast industry, though it still has some work to do on the leadership side. As my colleague Megan Lazovic has expressed in the past, it has made much progress when it comes to women listenership. The listener gender gap in the US over here is closing, and we also see evidence of that in the UK. 39% of UK women are monthly podcast listeners, and 26% are weekly listeners, similar rates to that of the total population. Those looking to reach UK women through podcasts will rejoice in the year-over-year increase in monthly listenership we observed among female consumers in the UK, an 8-point increase since last year. Today, female listeners represent about half of the monthly podcast listening audience, a 1-point shift from last year. Before 2023, the gender gap was probably wider. We can't say for sure, but we do know more and more and more and more and more women are adding podcasts to their routines. The UK female weekly podcast listenership rate increased 4 points since last year. And here are just a few of the most popular shows appealing to the UK female audience. Slightly different than those appealing to men: The Diary of a CEO, Saving Grace, Shagged, Married, and Annoyed reached the largest number of UK women. Joe Rogan drops to 7th among the female audience, and you see shows like Off Menu and Parenting Hell in the top 10 among women, but you don't see them among the male UK audience. Podcast listeners are also a highly coveted audience by advertisers. Compared to the UK population, monthly podcast listeners are more likely to be employed, and they are more likely to have a university degree. And they're more likely to be affluent as well. A third, or over a third, 37% of the UK population on the left is university educated, compared with 47% of monthly podcast listening pool, a 10-point difference. And here's a comparison of employment status. 58% of Britons are employed either full-time or part-time, while 2/3 of monthly podcast listeners are in the same status. When it comes to spending power, the UK monthly podcast audience is 25% more likely to earn a household income of £75,000 or more than the average UK adult. Now, since we began collecting data for Edison podcast metrics, we have seen a relatively small number of big hit shows deliver significant reach against the base of weekly podcast listeners. We can also look at the combined reach of shows by adding the number of listeners between shows, then deducing the listeners to both, or deducting the listeners to both shows. The graphic here shows how audience is accumulated as more and more shows are added from the top down. The top 10 podcasts are the biggest hits combined. They combine to reach 31% of all weekly podcast listeners in the UK. As you continue to build reach cumulatively, you can see that the top 25 podcasts reach 44% of weekly podcast listeners in the kingdom, with only the top 25 biggest shows. Nearly half of all weekly podcast listeners are accessible. The audience builds from there, but one has to buy more shows to achieve incremental reach. The top 100 shows reach 61% of the weekly podcast listening audience, and the top 300 podcasts yield a reach of 72%. In order to access the remaining 28%, though, you will have to go through smaller shows. Smaller shows provide access to the audience that these podcasts, the top 300 podcasts, cannot reach. Now, when someone asks you how valuable podcasting is, you know what to say. Remember the key points. Podcast listenership is at an all-time high in the UK. Weekly consumers spend more than 5 hours with the medium each week. Podcasts reach all generations. There's tremendous opportunity in reaching young, old, and everyone in between. Podcast listeners are increasingly diverse, both ethnically and gender-wise. They are an affluent bunch and are heavily sought after by advertisers. I hope this helps shine some light on the evolution of podcasts in the UK. And above all, I do hope it helps you take your podcast to the next level by advocating to advertisers and other stakeholders. If you do have any questions or simply want to chat, reach out to us at info@edisonresearch.com. We hope to cover more of the UK consumer in the coming months. I'll now take a look at any questions that I may be able to answer live here. Let's see. Okay, no questions. Perfect. Great. Well, if you do think of any questions for the future, you can always reach out to us at info@edisonresearch.com or visit our website at edisonresearch.com. Until next time, cheers, everyone.